And we have some breaking news on the 2020 front. Ohio Senator Sherrod Brown has just announced he will not run for president. Instead, plans to remain in the Senate. Is that another signal Joe Biden is about to jump in? Joining me now, Ron Klain, a former senior White House aide to Presidents Clinton and Obama, well known to Joe Biden, and former chief of staff, of course, to Vice Presidents Gore and Biden. Jim Messina, former White House deputy chief of staff for President Obama, and Rick Tyler, former senior advisor to Ted Cruz and Newt Gingrich, and an MSNBC political analyst. Ron Klain, you know Joe Biden as well as anyone sitting at this table. I've been reporting that he's going to jump in, maybe trying to wait till April. Sherrod Brown, I thought, was in, and a lot of people in the party thought he was a big factor here.
Yeah, I mean, Senator Brown had done a lot of things to get ready. He'd been on this listening tour, Dignity of Work tour. He would have been a very formidable candidate had he chosen to run. He's not running. Look, I think ultimately Vice President Biden's going to make his own decision about whether or not this is the right thing for him, the right thing for his family, the right thing for the country. And I don't think that's affected by anyone else's choice, but it obviously does remove one other person who would have been a very formidable opponent in this race.
Now, he said in Delaware last week that his family had decided that they're ready to go, they're ready to take whatever the burdens are, and there are going to be plenty. Jim Messina, we've seen now Mike Bloomberg, another candidate, billionaire, saying yesterday that he will put his money where his mouth is and can put his money into battleground states to try to defeat Donald Trump and elect a Democrat. Now you see Sherrod Brown bowing out. It does seem as another signal that Joe Biden's in.
Oh, I think so. And Ron can't celebrate on national TV, but this is a big moment for Joe Biden because, Sherrod Brown would have split labor with Joe Biden. Joe Biden would have a bunch of support with labor, as would Sherrod Brown. You talked about Michael Bloomberg. That's also helpful for Joe Biden because it kind of deals with the statesman moderate lane that Biden's going to try to compete in. Bloomberg's announcement yesterday was one of the most selfless things I've seen recently in American politics. I think there was a tough pathway for him, but a pathway, and he's decided to spend several $100 million of his own money to beat Donald Trump, and that's another very good thing if you're Joe Biden. Joe Biden is the only person in this field, to Ron's point, that can make his own decision. Everyone else has to kind of say, what are the other candidates in? What is my lane? Biden can sit back and wait for this, and I think everyone thinks Biden's running. The other big unknown card out there, Andrea, is Beto. What's Beto doing? And that's the other thing that people are going to find out reportedly next week.
And people like Eric Swalwell, other younger
Correct.
members of Congress who want to run, who are talking about running, looking over their shoulder at Beto because of his, viral ability online.
Yeah, and fundraising ability.
And fundraising ability.
Yeah, it's true. In the grassroots, I now live in San Francisco, and there's more Beto T-shirts in the streets of San Francisco than there is 49ers T-shirts. I mean, Beto is a national phenomenon who's going to take some oxygen out of the race.
Well, let's turn to our Texan, or someone who at least knows Texas politics very well, if not a Texan. So Beto O'Rourke came close, but didn't succeed in defeating, Ted Cruz, whom you worked for. What is the phenomenon that Beto O'Rourke is? Can he compete with Joe Biden, some of these other, Kamala Harris, some of these other very high-profile, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders?
I'm a little intimidated by the Democratic experts at the table. But the way I see it, I think Beto did electrify the progressive base. And essentially it is coming down, and I think it's very favorable to Joe Biden again because the progressive lane is getting very crowded. I think Beto could dominate the progressive lane, but then in a classic establishment progressive race, you're going to have someone who's going to merge out of the progressive part of the party and someone who's going to merge out of the establishment part of the party. But the thing that favors Joe Biden is I think Democrats are asking themselves who can beat Donald Trump. And I think you'd have a better chance with a more moderate candidate toward the center of peeling off the middle and some Republicans who don't want to vote for Donald Trump than you would with a progressive.
Now, but you also, Ron, have the ability of Democrats to just kill each other off and fight amongst themselves. Democrats complaining that Joe Biden said something in passing at the Munich Security Conference about, how, Mike Pence is a decent man or a good man. That lit up the internet. And now you have the whole issue in the Democratic House caucus about what to do about Congresswoman Omar. And Democratic candidates are coming out. Bernie Sanders coming out in support of her. I mean, it's already dividing some of the 2020 Democrats.
Well, look, we're Democrats. We're not an organized political party, as Will Rogers famously said a long time ago. But I think if he chooses to run, and he'll make that choice when he makes it, Vice President Biden is uniquely positioned to unite the Democratic Party. I saw a poll this week that said that Democrats were divided among a lot of labels, but the one label that united the party was Obama Democrats. This is a party that still believes that we had 8 great years in the White House of action on health care, on the economy, on social issues, on foreign policy issues. The co-architect of that era, the person who was at the side of the president doing that, is Joe Biden. I think he brings that legacy to the race and the opportunity to embrace a wide swath of people, progressives and moderates, people of all races, all parts of our party. He's the one candidate who can put that together if he chooses to run.
What about the age factor, which did come up in our NBC News Wall Street Journal poll, where you've got Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders and certainly Joe Biden in one group, if you will, and some of the others who are far younger?
I think it's a real issue, right? But I want to go back to Rick's point. 61% of Democrats say the most important issue in the Democratic primary is who can beat Donald Trump. Donald Trump unifies the Democratic Party. Whoever comes out of this primary, sure, it'll be difficult, sure, it'll be ugly, but 2008, Barack Obama beat Hillary Clinton on the very last day of the very last primary, and we all came together and won a general election. I'm not worried about unifying the party. What I'm worried about is someone who can stand up to Donald Trump, and that's why a lot of people are looking at Joe Biden and other folks who are tough enough to do that. On the age issue, again, it sets up well for Beto. You know, some of the biggest people in this primary, the top people in this primary, are over 70 years old. And that contrast for Beto is pretty interesting and will help him. Obviously, Vice President Biden has the Obama legacy that Ron just talked about, which is a very big issue.
I don't think Biden would exploit for political purposes the youth and inexperience of his appearance.
I was at that debate, that Reagan debate with Mondale in '84. Thank you, Rick Tyler.
Thank you.
Jim Messina, Ron Klain. It's great to be with all of you.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.